This conference will now be recorded.
All right. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining the session. And my name is Adam, and I'm part of Wezva Technologies. So, what is the agenda for today, right? Now, pretty much if you see, there's a lot of confusion among people that how is that you want to be a DevOps engineer, or what is that you need to learn to become a DevOps engineer, right? So just by learning some tools like Ansible or Terraform or AWS or Kubernetes, you can't just be a DevOps engineer. Because to understand it a better way, let's take a small example. Assume that you're running a shop. Let's say you're running an ice cream shop or ice cream parlor. Now you prepare some plain ice creams like vanilla or let's say strawberry and chocolate or butterscotch. Now what happens when customers come to your place? You need to understand what is that they need, right? So let's assume there's a customer who comes in and says, I don't want just plain one ice cream. I need something as a combination, or let's say he looks for some sundae ice creams. So it's all about combining different things, right? So that's when are you going to put up a board saying, hey, in my shop, I have only 4 varieties or 5 varieties of ice cream. Only those who want this should come. No, that doesn't work, right? So if you want to make sure your business is going to grow and you want to make a good sale of yourself in the shop, then you need to first understand what is that the customer wants. And there could be people like youngsters, there could be middle-aged. Now you need to understand what is the latest trend going on in the market, right? So what are the different flavors they are expecting? So based on that, if you put your shop, then your business is boom. Same way, when you go out to the market and in an IT field, if you say that you want to get a better job, it's not that you just learn 1 or 2 tools and step in. Okay, so you need to first understand what exactly an organization is looking for. So for which we need to basically understand in the concept of DevOps, what is that an organization is having a goal, and to solve that goal or to achieve that goal, what are the different problem statements that we will be able to solve, and what is the automation that we need to know. So that's the whole concept of what we are going to learn today. Okay, so we are going to understand what is the goal of a DevOps in an organization, and based on that, what are the latest trends which are available in the market, and what are the tools in that latest trend that we should be available. So once we learn this, then we will have the clear roadmap for our career. And based on that, you should be planning how to learn and then achieve your goal of getting into an organization as a DevOps engineer. So that's the whole point of what we are going to do today. Okay. So to get started, now when we say DevOps, okay, so there are various terms as we use, but DevOps is more of a culture where an organization is trying to solve some problem to meet their business needs, right? So in that way, in an organization, you can primarily divide the entire set of the working people in terms of technical into 2 groups. So one, you can call them as the dev group, or that is what we ideally call it as a product group. Now, when I say product group, so you will be having developers, QA engineers, and then release engineers or support engineers, right? So pretty much anyone who is going to work closely towards the product will be part of this dev group or the product group. Now, on the other side, when I say the operations group, now what is that you will be doing? So all those people who focus on the data center management, because for a company, you need a set of people to create a product, test a product, and release the product. But to do all this work, what you need is a data center. Okay, not just the infra, but the entire data center. So this is where you would be having a bunch of responsibilities to manage your data center, networking, and again, monitoring all of them. Now, this is where you will have a separate operations group. So in terms of DevOps, an organization will try to solve the problems which is both on the product group as well as on the operations group. So by saying it, what exact problems do you solve in each of the group? Okay, because what happens when you go to an organization as a DevOps engineer, you will not be fitting in everywhere. So you will be either joining a team within a product group, or you will be joining a team within the operations group, right? So in that way, you need to first understand what is the goal that a company is trying to solve in terms of what problems they have in the product group or what problems they have in the operations group. And that's where, if you focus towards a requirement for a DevOps engineer in a product group, your focus will be highly into ensuring how can we release the products faster. Okay, so what do you mean by releasing a product faster? So this is where, if there are developers and QA, now we need to make sure how they can do continuous development or how do they do continuous testing. And instead of having releases which will take months or years, now organization wants to release their product in a matter of weeks or even sometimes in matter of days. So that's when the focus on the DevOps for a product group is majorly towards how do you do faster releases. Okay, and it's not just about doing releases faster, but equally, you need to ensure the quality of the product is increased. Okay, and this is where you will be doing a lot of new concepts like static code analysis, right, or vulnerability checks, and ensure that while you release your product faster, your quality of the product is also higher. But at the same time, as a product team, you should also focus on increased agility. So what do you mean by agility? So let's say I have a product. Now, earlier I was releasing in 3 months, and now I'm trying to release it in 2 weeks. Okay. So if this is the goal that you're trying to achieve, okay, now along with that, because of the change in the market, there will be a lot of parallel things that you need to do. So how agile is your team, or agile means how do you make sure when you are focusing on one release, if there is another release that you want to work in parallel, you should be able to do together. Okay, that means while you're focusing on a release, if there is a bug fix which comes, or if there is a enhancement for a particular customer that you want to do, you cannot say wait until I finish this and then I will take the other changes. So if you do that, things won't work. So that's when, based on the market trend, you should be able to focus on how do we deliver things in parallel within a given time. Okay, so that's what agility is all about. Now, when we are doing all those things, we need to have an ability that it's not just that I can quickly write a code and quickly write a test code for doing all my testing, but also the ability that your product should be able to run successfully, right? Because take an again example, have you ever seen that the bigger organizations or things like Facebook or Google or Myntra, has it ever gone down? Or do they say, okay, we are going to do a new release every day, so every day for 2 hours our site will not be working? That doesn't happen, right? So what happens on the background? They work in an agile way. That means whenever changes are there, they try to update it in such a way that it doesn't impact the existing workflow. So that's when, along with working faster and better quality, you also have to make sure that you have the ability to roll out your applications or do newer releases in a better way. And at the same time, we also need to make sure that all those things are working fine. Because the same example that I said, are we sure that there is going to be no problem in any of the companies? No, definitely there will be a lot of problems when we do an upgrade, or there could be some issues in the network. But how do they make sure there is no impact for a customer, right? So Facebook or Google going down is like once in a blue moon, and that also will be just about a couple of minutes. Things will be back. So how do you make sure such a kind of high availability that you're going to have? And that's where it's not just that your product should be created faster or released faster. We should have the ability to do quick changes, roll, or what we call it as technically roll out our releases, and to monitor. Now, this is what An organization in terms of DevOps will be focusing on the product side. But since the DevOps doesn't just focus only on the product side, we also equally focus on the operation side of an organization. And this is when, for all those applications that you are developing, testing, and deploying, now you need a data center to manage. So how do you make sure those machines and applications are highly available? You might need a storage or you might need a database. How do you make sure that it is always highly available, right? And not just that, because of an agile way of working, today you might have 10 customers, tomorrow you might have 20 customers, and it might grow to 100 customers soon. So to help them and to serve all those customers, you also equally need your infrastructure should be scalable, right? Because from 10 products, now you have started working on 100 products. So your entire infrastructure is also going to increase. So that's when, how do you make sure that your infrastructure needs can also be easily scaled up and down depending on the necessity or the load? And at the same time, you also have to make sure how secure is all these applications and services within your organization, right? Because we cannot just allow everyone to work on everything. So that is what operations side the DevOps focuses on. And finally, there is another important aspect which in the DevOps of the operations side we focus is called as disaster recovery. So what do you mean by disaster recovery? So let's say you have an application running or you have a database running. It's not just important to make sure that the database is always running or you have the ability to scale the machine or storage that you want. But what happens if something goes wrong, right? If your machine crashes, then do you have the ability to bring back everything in the same state what you had? That's what we call it as disaster recovery. So from an operation side, the DevOps focuses that not just about running the application and using the application, but also on the back end of it, how do you make sure that the application, you take proper backup? How do you make sure that there is a proper replication of the data? How do you store it? And how do you recover it? And you can also have scenarios like you don't want all the load to go to a particular application. You can divide it like read-write access or read-only access. So all those things you are going to manage. So that's how a company in terms of DevOps focuses. So now if you understand, these are the problems that being a DevOps engineer, you have to solve. But what happens now? It is not going to be a duty of a single person or a single DevOps engineer to solve everything. Why? Because if you join a DevOps engineer being a product group, then your major focus will be. You join an organization to be part of an operations group, then your major focus will be this. However, now we need to know an organization sometimes might also ask you to work on a combination of these. Okay, so that's where now in order to solve all these individuals' problems or problem statements, we need to know what are the different concepts or what we call it as DevOps trends which is available, okay, which is what we need to learn. So by saying it, pretty much now in the market, okay, can everyone go on mute please? Okay, so when you look at the current market, okay, so these are what we call it as the DevOps trends or the DevOps concepts. And this solves all the problem that we were talking about in the previous slide. Okay, so the first concept or the DevOps trend, what we have is called as version controlling system, or what this is going to solve. It's going to solve a concept called continuous development. So now when a developers are writing a code, it's not about which programming language that they are using, but how they should be developing as a team so that we will be able to deliver faster, which is where they should be able to collaborate with different people across different teams. So for that, all the code, whatever that we are going to develop, has to be stored and maintained into a location, which is what we call it as continuous development. Okay. Now, for this, you need to work in an agile concept. So as soon as you get a requirement, it's not that you will be starting to write a code. So we need to know how an organization will work in an agile way. For that, how should we prioritize our work, and how is that on a day-to-day we should be taking up the work. Okay, so that's the whole concept over here. But again, question might come, is it only for developers? Okay. So the problem here is, as we say continuous development, it is not only a developer who is going to write a Java program or a Node program will be called as a developer. Here, in terms of DevOps, there are a lot of tasks which requires us to do some kind of development, which can be a script or it could be some kind of configuration files. So when we say development, development is not always a product development or an application development. So for your automation, you can also develop a script or a configuration file or some kind of document. Okay. So in the DevOps world, as we move forward, you will be required to develop some kind of file, which might be a script or a configuration file, or it can also be a simple document. So that is where all of us have to go through the process, wherein end of the day, where are you going to store it? So you're going to store it into a common location, which is what we call it as version controlling system. Okay. So this is when it's important whether you are a developer or a QA or an application support person or even an administrator. Anything that you do in a day-to-day for automation, it has to be a script or a file, or it has to be a document or a configuration file. So in order for you to store, you're not going to use a machine or a hard drive. Instead, you're going to store it into this version controlling system. So that's when, as an organization, everyone needs to understand how to use this concept called version controlling system, for which there are various tools available which you need to be familiar. The same way, the next important trend which we have in DevOps is infrastructure as a code. Because once again, in DevOps, there is no limit on who should be doing what. It is all dependent on only two factors. So which side of the organization group that you are joining, and if you are given a chance to take up additional responsibility, you should be able to do. So this is where now, being a developer or a QA or application support engineer or a storage guy or a database administrator, your work is not only to take care of an application or just to run some tests or scripts. Now, for your day-to-day work, if you need an infrastructure to be set up, okay, then you don't have to wait for someone else like a separate admin team to do it. So this is where now, when the whole things have been moved to cloud, you should be aware on how you can create a small infrastructure or a big infrastructure which is needed for your day-to-day work. Okay, so for that, how are you going to automate? Which is where the concept what we have called as infrastructure as code. So now here, once again, there are various tools which are available. Now out of that, if you hear, Terraform is one of the popular tool. So what are you going to do? You're going to write some kind of Terraform script using which the requirement that you have for your development or testing or database or support or deployment, you are going to connect to a cloud service provider and create that infrastructure by yourself. So that's when, additionally, the responsibility that you're going to have by given a chance is you should know how do you create that infra. So creating an infra can be as simple as just creating a machine, or it could be something like creating a machine and a database, or creating a machine, a database, and a network for it. So it's completely up to what is that you are going to do, and for that, what kind of infrastructure that you need. So by using this concept in an organization, each one of us will be able to create our own infrastructure and maintain it. So that is how in DevOps, by adopting to this concept of infrastructure as a code, managing infrastructure will be very easy by every one of us. Okay. Next, when we talk about infrastructure, now infrastructure is all about, let's say an example, you create a machine or you create a machine and a database. That's it. But for you to do a specific work like a development work or some kind of testing work or some kind of support or deployment work, when you create a machine, the infrastructure as a code only deals with creating that machine. That's all. But after creating the machine, how will you configure that machine so that it is suitable for your deployment need, or it is suitable for your development need, or it is suitable for your testing need? Which is where in DevOps, the next trend what we have is called as configuration as code. So here what you are going to do, so there are a bunch of tools available. Using that, you are going to write some kind of code or a script in which you will tell what is your desired configuration, so that once you create an infrastructure using this concept called infrastructure as a code, you are going to automate the process of configuring that machine. So this is how DevOps doesn't just focus only on creating a machine, but you focus on creating your infrastructure using IAC. But once you have the infra, you can also think about automating that infra to configure depending on what exactly you're going to do inside the machine. So that's when we have the concept called configuration as code. So now, if you look, if you want to do a work, the first thing you should do is you should be able to get the infrastructure, and that automation is IAC. And once you get that infrastructure, you should be able to automatically configure it so that whatever the application or services that you want is already running in it. So that's how it's a combination of IAC and configuration as a code put together, you will be able to get your environment. So that is where before you do some work in a company for your development or testing or deployment or support, you first need an infrastructure to be available. For that, use IAC to automate the creation and maintenance, and use the configuration concept to automatically manage the configuration of a machine. Okay, so that's a high level difference between IAC and CAC. You create a machine using IAC and you configure the machine using configuration management. Okay, now once you are able to do this in DevOps, the next focus is on what we call it as continuous integration. Because now for a development or a testing, you know how to create your infra and configure your infra and how they are going to write the code and manage the code. But now, once the code has been written, you need to have an ability to test it continuously. So that is where the concept of continuous integration comes in. So this is a series of steps, or generally what we call it as a pipeline, in which you take the code from a version controlling system, you go through a series of steps wherein you convert that code into a deployable artifact. Okay, when I say a deployable artifact, when the code is written in something like Java, you're going to take that, convert it into a jar or a var, and not just that, you are also going to make sure that you have completely gone through the quality check of it, which is what we generally call it as quality gates. So you don't just convert the Java into jar or a var, but make sure that there is sufficient quality in it, which is where in the quality gates you go through things like code coverage or code quality. So for that, there are a bunch of tools which is available. So now in an organization, anyone can take up this responsibility, wherein in addition to all these, once you have your infrastructure available, then you're going to set up this continuous integration process. Okay. Now, when we say continuous integration, the focus here is only to generate an artifact or a product which can be consumed. But eventually, just by creating a product, it is not sufficient, because for me to do my testing, or if I want to put it into production, what we technically call that concept as deployment. Okay, so you have to take this product that you have generated here and you should install it in whatever machines that you want, and you should be running them. So if it is one machine, it sounds easy. But as we move into production, there will be hundreds of machines that you have to maintain. So that is where our focus in DevOps is not to just generate a product which is good, but we also need a product which can be easily deployable. And that's where the whole concept of what we call it as containerization comes into the picture. Okay, so now if you have your application which is like a jar or a var or a node application, how do you make sure that it can be containerized, and how can you run it against multiple machines? Okay, which is where more concepts like Docker or Kubernetes comes into the picture. So for an organization, it is also necessary that they should focus on a trend called setting up deployment orchestration, so that whatever the deliverable that you get here, you convert it into an image, which is what we technically call it as Docker image, and you have the ability of that to run it against multiple machines as a cluster. So for that, you might need on top of that another tool like Kubernetes. So that's what the trend called deployment orchestration focuses. Now, when we talk about all these things, generally this both works hand in hand. This is where we generally call it as a pipeline called CI and CD, because you build whatever the artifact you need and you deploy it, whether it is on a QA or a production. But when we are going through this, there will be a lot of checks that you have to do, and there are a lot of processes that you have to handle, because practically if you see, the setup that things will happen by CI, right, will be taken care majorly by the product side of the team or product owner. And when you look at the CD part, so this will be taken care by the operations side. So now, how does it collaborate together? That's where there is a new concept called GitOps emerging. So what does this talk? So GitOps basically says whatever that you're trying to give output here, or the input that you need for a CD, rather than just directly taking it, you try to define everything again in terms of some code or a script. And due to any change that you give in this, you will be able to automatically trigger certain actions, or what we call it as pipeline. So that is where organizations are slowly moving towards not just CI/CD, but a technique called as continuous delivery, in which you should be seamlessly able to handle this process called CI. And once this is completed, you can automatically also trigger the part called CD through this concept called GitOps. And now, again, there are a lot of tools available in the market for GitOps. Okay, like you have Spinnaker or FlexCD or Argo CD. Now, that is where your responsibility in an organization doesn't end only with working on Docker or Kubernetes, but you are actually doing a deployment. Then you should also be knowing how to use some additional tool which supports the concept of continuous delivery, which is nothing but GitOps on top of the CI/CD. Okay. Now, we are talking more about only the concepts for a release. But what happens now? For all this work, there are a lot of applications and machines and services which will be running. So DevOps says you should also focus on a trend to monitor them, because this is when, if something goes wrong or if a machine goes down, what will happen? So you should have the ability to monitor. This is where I was telling you, right? So do you think Facebook or Google doesn't have any issues? Definitely they have issues, but how do they solve? That is the trend, what we call it as continuous monitoring. So by adopting to this concept, you should be able to monitor continuously whatever the applications that you have, or whatever machines you have, or whatever services you are running, and take necessary action before it becomes a bottleneck. So that is when in DevOps, one of the other important trend which organization wants to follow is continuous monitoring. Okay. And then comes a new concept called log management. Now people might think, what is this? So when you are doing a continuous monitoring and you're trying to make sure that your application and machines are working fine, what happens? in order to debug some problem, you need some logs, whether it is an application log or a machine log. So where are you going to get that? So this is where it's very important that, especially when you're deploying your applications in QA or production, how do you get the logs from the applications and how do you manage them? Because a user should also have the ability to have a look at the logs, right? And that is where now in DevOps, there is a trend also to maintain your logs. Now that log can be again an application log, or the log can also be from a machine, or it could be a service log. So at any point of time, as an organization in the DevOps, we should also focus on how do we manage the logs. Okay. And finally, one of the other latest trend that we have in the DevOps is security. Okay. So now the question comes, why security? Because when we are talking, if you remember, I told how do you improve the quality of your whole release. And it is also necessary that whatever the product that we are generating is not having much of vulnerabilities. Because is it good that you generate a product and you give that product to a customer and it is not secure? Like let's say Facebook or Google. What will happen if your account is hackable, right? Will you be happy? No. So what we need to do, we need to make sure that the products that we are delivering are also secure, and not just that, the infrastructure that we use to manage all these things should also be secure. That is where in DevOps, security is also important. So security at every level is important. That is what we call it as DevSecOps. So where does security come in? So if you are trying to use your code and you are going to store, how are you going to manage that you give a specific security on who should be working, who should not be working, what kind of branches that you are going to have? That is what we call it as a DevSecOps practice. Let's come to IAC. Do you think you can, if you have the ability to learn a tool like Terraform, can you go and do a production work? No, because for production, there will be a separate account, or if you take in terms of cloud, there will be a separate username and password given to you. The same way, if you're going to do some development or QA infrastructure, there is a separate account given to you. So that is how there is a security practice at every level. Even when you say you want to work on CI or CD, there will be some bunch of tools. So it is not that everyone will be given access to every tool. So you need to understand who is going to work, who just needs read access, who needs read write access. That's how the security is going to come at every level. And when I was talking about CI, I was talking about something called as quality gates. That's again part of your security. So you will make sure that your code is secure, and that's where you will be doing certain things like static code analysis, vulnerability check, and talk about Docker images. You are also going to scan your Docker images and ensure that the images doesn't have any vulnerability. And when you talk about accessing your deployments, we are not going to allow everyone to access your cluster. Okay, once again, can you guys mute? Okay, so that's how, even when you are running a cluster of machines, we need to give access based on role, whether you are going to work as an admin or whether you are going to work as just a developer or an operation person. So this way, DevSecOps is not something separate. It is a best practice which you implement at every level of the trend. And whenever you are using any tools, for all the tools, there will be some security applied. So that's how you make sure your application is secure, your product is secure, as well as the entire infrastructure is secure. So that's what we are going to do. So now, talking about all these, how are you going to actually do it? So this is where for every trend, there are a bunch of tools available in the market. But however, when you are planning or deciding to move your career into DevOps, it's not possible that you will be able to learn all the tools in a site. So that way, you should be smart enough to understand what is the latest tool in the trend and try to learn at least one of the tools so that you are familiar and you're confident saying that, yes, I know the subject. And this is where, if you start going in little deeper. Now, when you talk about the agile process, which is where you should be knowing in a company before even you do any work, right? So whether you might be working on a cloud or you're working on a support work or a development or a testing. Now, why are you even doing it? Because there is a requirement for a product to be released or supported. So that is where the first thing you need to know how organization works in an agile way. Okay. And as part of it, you will be working on continuous development. Then you should be familiarized with concepts like Git. Again, when you say Git, it's just a client side. So there is equally another side of it called a server side, which is where you should be familiar with any latest tool like GitLab. Now, in that, you should also be knowing how to manage your GitLab for different projects. How do you securely give permissions, and what are the different branching mechanisms available to do different kind of work? So that's where your continuous development will be. Then, when you talk about continuous integration, so there are many tools, but still one of the tool which stands out for continuous integration among others is Jenkins. But just by using Jenkins, it's not sufficient, because when we say we have to set up a DevSecOps way of working, then in Jenkins, you are going to use a bunch of other tools and make sure that you work in a pipeline, which will help you to do the product generation and also make sure that you accomplish the quality gates concept. Okay. And then once a deliverable is generated, this is where I was telling you, you cannot just deploy it. So you need to convert it into what we call it as a Docker image. Now for that, you need to go through the concept of containerization, where given an image, you should know how to create a container, or if a chance is given, you should also know how do you create your own image for deploying. But when I talk about deploying, so this doesn't stop here, which is where the GitOps concept comes. Then as part of it, you will be using Helm charts, or you will be using some GitOps tool like FlexCD or Argo CD. Okay, so using that, you're going to run your containers. You're not just going to run your containers directly. However, we know that we cannot manage the containers directly on a machine, and that's when your deployment orchestration comes in, which is nothing but Kubernetes, which is the most popular and talk of DevOps, right? So you should be knowing how do you deploy your applications inside the Kubernetes cluster and how does this work. However, when we are talking about all these, there is also your applications needs log management, which is where for doing a log management, one of the popular set of tool as part of cloud native formation is using the EFK stack, which is Elasticsearch, Fluentd, and Kibana. Okay, and side by side, now if you look, if you want to work on the infrastructure automation and to implement the concept of infrastructure as a code, then you are going to learn a cloud agnostic tool like Terraform, because Terraform works good whether you're having AWS or Azure or GCP, everything works good. So that's where if you say you're going to work on infrastructure as a code, then definitely you need to learn one of the latest tool, which is Terraform. Same way, now when we talk about configuration management or configuration as a code, then Ansible stands out, right? Because still there are tools like Chef and Puppet, but that doesn't serve the complete purpose. So what you need is a latest tool, which is Ansible, which again serves for most of the purpose. Okay. And finally, when we talk about monitoring, now again, there are a lot of tools available, but since everything is based on cloud, then one of the popular tools which you see in the market, which can help you to monitor application or monitor your containers or monitor your machines or services, then you need a tool like Prometheus and Grafana, using which you can monitor everything. Like I said, monitor a machine or monitor a cluster or monitor your container or monitor your service. So which is where by learning continuous monitoring, you should be knowing any one of the latest tools which will help you to monitor everything. Okay. And finally, where does all these things run? It runs in cloud, which is where you should also be aware of how all these things happen in a cloud. Okay. So now comes the last question is, okay, so you're telling what are the different trends or what are the different concepts and what are the tools available in the market. So how do you become a DevOps engineer? So this is where now if you go back, it's the same ice cream shop concept that I was telling you. If you have only a limited set of flavors, awesome. Guys, can you mute? Okay. So now, just to say the same example, if you are running your ice cream parlor, if you have only a limited set of flavors, then you can serve only certain customers. So that's where now in the same concept, if you want to become a DevOps engineer, first, there are some fundamental things that you need to prepare. Okay. And then you are going to talk about the actual trends of the DevOps, which we call it as DevOps core, and which is where you will be learning the concepts like continuous development, continuous integration, continuous delivery, GitOps, monitoring, infrastructure as a code. Now, you can stop only until here. But if you stop only until here, then you will be able to fit into those organizations who focus more about the product side of the problems. Okay. However, if you also want to go to organization where regardless of whether you're going to join the product team or the operations team or a combination of both, which is where now the companies are expecting that you should also be aware of how you manage the infrastructure on the cloud. So that's where now let's assume that you are working on all these tools like Docker, Kubernetes, or Jenkins, or Terraform, or Ansible. Now, where does it work? So you need an infra. Now, if that infra is going to be a cloud like AWS, what and all do you need to know? Now, you can either stop just by being a DevOps engineer saying that you are familiar with the application side, or now, if the organization asks you that, okay, why do you want to stop? What if I give you more responsibility where can you take care of the operations that you have to do in cloud? That is related to these tools. For example, if you do a deployment, where are you going to do? You're going to use it a Kubernetes cluster. Now, where does Kubernetes runs? In AWS, there is a service called as EKS. So now, if you are also aware of how to manage a EKS cluster, how to create a cluster, how do you do a scaling of it, how do you make sure that it is secure, then it is also going to help an organization. The same way, when you are doing all this activity, let's say you need a database. So it is not just that you know how to work on Docker or Jenkins, but if there is a need, you should also be able to know how do you set up a database in cloud, and how do you make sure that you have a proper storage for that, and how do you make sure that it can also scale. So that's when nowadays, if you see the profile, companies are not just asking only these tools, but as a combination, they can also ask you to do some operations on the cloud. And that's when, as you start knowing the DevOps core, and then as the next step, when you start learning these aspects of the cloud operations, that's when you can become an architect. So there's just a small difference. So a DevOps engineer is one who focuses only on the tools and process, and a CloudOps engineer is a person who focuses only on administration and operations on any one of the cloud. But if you want yourself to have a wider profile and lot of opportunities, and that's where everyone is looking for a better salary, right? Then your focus should be to move towards DevOps architect, wherein architect is a person who can help an organization in solving the problems in tools or process, as well as you can also help a company in doing some operations in the cloud. Now, this varies from years of experience. If you're a junior person, then you have to work more on the tools on both the sides. But let's say as you grow with some experience of 8 years or so, you can become a lead, and under you, there will be certain people. The same thing if you grow with much more experience, then what happens? Same way, you can either be into management or you can be an architect where under you there will be multiple people wherein you define how to work on this and how to work on this and what is the best practice. So that's where to have a better profile now in organization, it's not just sufficient to know only the core. As a next step, once you learn this, you also have to learn the cloud operations. So the more you know, the better that you would be having an opportunity to grow. Okay. And finally, now we come back. So this is where, how do you prepare? So what we do specifically for this is we design this course in such a way, if you are a beginner and you don't know where to start, then we have an exclusive DevOps master program, which runs 8 weeks of live sessions, wherein every day you will have around 2 to 2.5 hours of session. And in that, you will be learning all the latest trends of DevOps. So that way, you don't focus on the administration side of the cloud, but you use cloud like AWS to set up everything and you get the confidence. And by completing it, you will be able to fit into any position which is focusing towards the product side of an organization. So that's how, whatever the trends that we are talking, you're going to go through all of them. And additionally, to help you prepare, we know that it's not sufficient just to go through these tools, but to get more of a real-time experience, we get you more than 20 plus projects to help. So that's how it's going to be a scenario-based learning where you understand the problem and then you take latest tool and you learn it and implement it. Don't just go back and say that I have learned. You should go back and say, this is what I have done in my company already. That's how you're going to add value to your profile. But now, after you learn this, if you're still looking for a better profile where you can move as an architect, which is where, like I was saying, you also need to know the operations that you can do in the cloud related to all those tools. So that's where, specifically when we take AWS, now in AWS, it's not just about creating a machine, but if you look at it, you should know for a development or a testing work or for creating a Jenkins machine or a Docker machine or a Kubernetes, what type of machine that you want. What is the capacity change on it? How do you choose what machine to take and when to take? That's where you're going to learn. Same way, how do you scale your infrastructure? Whether you are running a database or whether you are running a EKS cluster or whether you are running your Jenkins, how are you going to make sure that your entire infrastructure is scalable, right? That's how in the cloud operations, you're going to learn all the aspects of the cloud with AWS. And here too, it's not just about learning some buttons to click and, oh, I know how to create a machine. No, you need to get more hands-on with projects so that you can go back and relate. At the end, you can say, being a DevOps engineer, if a problem is given to you, you know how to automate and solve, as well as in an AWS infra, you can also handle the cloud operations. So that's the whole concept of how you will be able to get better profile. Okay. And finally, for any of this course that you take, like I said, you can either start with the master program and learn all the concepts of the DevOps core, or you can also learn the CloudOps separately. If not, you can also combine both of them and learn. But the only difference is it takes time. Okay, so you need to understand what is your roadmap, where do you want to start and where you want to end. So based on that, you take all the steps and the tools necessary and start working in the project. Okay, and finally, why this program? So we don't just go through the concepts of teaching only the tools, but what we also make sure is each and every day that we are going through, the live sessions will be recorded and it will be given to you. And like I said, we don't jump into a command and a tool and give you, because when you go to an interview, they won't ask you commands. They will first ask you, why did you do this? What made you to do? So that's where you need to understand the problem statement. And the same example of an ice cream shop, right? It's not that everyone will eat the same flavor. So you should be knowing, how do I mix different flavors of ice creams to give different taste? And that's what you're going to learn here, okay? It's not about learning each individual tool, but you are going to learn how, as a DevOps engineer, you can combine different tools to solve a problem, so that in an interview or in an organization, if there is a requirement, you should be able to fit into it easily. And for all these things, it's not just going to be talking about the tools, but we are going to get you lots and lots of scenarios based on real-time examples and lots of practice sessions that you can go through. So that's how it's going to be a completely hands-on session where all you need to do is sit back, listen to the class, take up all the notes, and then start practicing. So that's where, along with all those things, we will be guiding and mentoring you every time on how you should be moving forward. Okay, so it shouldn't be just like, okay, I watched all your video, I've gone through everything, now I have to apply. That won't happen. So we need to customize on your profile to say how all these things will be fitting to your individual career, right? Because all of you are not same. Some might have experience on development, some might have experience in support, some might have experience in database. So that is where, as a one-on-one suggestion, we would be able to help you and mentor on how exactly you should be able to focus to tune your career, so that when you start going out and applying for a job, you should be able to get into a good position. So that's the focus on how we make sure to mentor to fit into your right career. Okay, so that's the whole point of this program that we have planned. All right, so that's the questions, if anything that you have. If not, pretty much, this is what the agenda that we wanted to